This is a Ferrari 360, a car that needs no introduction, the car that propelled Ferrari into the 2000s. You're probably looking at the classifieds about now thinking, I could have one of them. Well, let me take you through all the common problems, let you know everything you need to know about them, then you can decide whether you want to take the plunge. Let's go. Now, before we get into the problems with the 360, one thing you want to think about is the specification of the car that you're thinking about buying. So without being too exhaustive, let me give you a couple of specification items that had to be on the list when I was shopping for a Ferrari 360. So number one, quite obvious, is colour. Does it need to be red for you? Obviously, red cars are going to command a premium, but that's really up to you. Secondly, something that's really desirable on these cars is the rear challenge grille. That's this black section here. If you've looked into these cars at all, you're probably familiar with that. It looks great and it's also practical because it lets the heat dissipate out of the engine bay a little bit better. Now, something often overlooked by a lot of people are the fact that you could get front challenge grilles as well, which is exactly what we've got on this car. The normal ones are more just like plastic slats, and I think these look really good too, so I'd have to have them. And then the final item for me that is a must is the Scuderia shields. If you get a look at these on the car that you're thinking about buying, you'll notice they're actually recessed into the wing. A lot of people will just get 10 quid sticker, slap it on and go for that effect, but there's no replacement for having the real factory badges recessed into the wing. So a 25-year-old Ferrari isn't going to have problems, is it? Yes, it is. Let me preface this by saying these are robust, well-made cars. It's just a fact of life. It's a high-performance car and it's getting on for 25, 30 years old. So naturally, there's going to be a few expensive problems in there, but let me take you through what they are. So let's kick off with the heart of the beast then, the 3.6 litre V8 Tipo 131 as it was known. And you think about that back in the year 1999, the year 2000, how revolutionary that was. The fact that this could produce 131 brake horsepower per litre was pretty much unheard of. I think it was Honda who came along with the S2000 and knocked it off the top spot. Anyway, problems, let's get into that. So one of the characteristics of this engine is it's a flat plane engine, as is quite typical with Ferrari. Now, one of the byproducts of being a flat plane crank is vibration, and as a count of that, it knocks hell out of the engine mounts and also the gearbox mount. So you'll need to replace these, say the engine mounts every 20,000 miles, and then the gearbox mount probably not far behind. Here's an added little tip as to how you can tell the gearbox mount is likely worn. And believe it or not, it's to do with the exhaust tips. So the exhaust on a 360 is actually mounted onto the gearbox. It's not onto the subframe, which is a bit unusual. But the result of that is we can look at the exhaust tips, and if they're drooping right down, chances are that gearbox bushing is probably worn. So one of the really revolutionary features on this engine is it had variable length intake manifolds. What this meant was the air could either take a long path or a short path into the engine. That helped with low down grunt, but it also meant the engine was just as alive as it should be when it was on song. Now, to control this system was some little butterflies on the inlets here. When the bushings on them start to go bad, they can make a hell of a rattling sound. Honestly, it sounds terminal on some cars that I've heard. Now, one way that you can check if that is the problem that you're seeing is you can reach in here and just underneath, you can touch that little assembly, and the minute you touch it, if that noise disappears, then that's exactly what it is. So one thing that's not so revolutionary on these engines, certainly by today's standards, is they use an old school heat exchanger. Now, at one end of this heat exchanger, we've got coolant, at the other end, we've got gearbox oil. The coolant is used to modulate the temperature of the gearbox oil, either heat it up or cool it down. The problem is these heat exchangers fail, especially as the cars are getting on a little bit, and when they do fail, they start to pass coolant into the gearbox oil, and this has been the death of many, many 360 gearboxes. So, as a precautionary thing, what I'll often tell owners to do when they have these cars is keep an eye on the coolant level. If that coolant level is dropping, but there's no visible leak, chances are that coolant is finding its way into the gearbox. If you catch it quite quickly and you flush that gearbox through and you flush the coolant through, then sometimes you can be okay, but often it's too late to save the gearbox and it needs a rebuild. So something else you'll likely read about on these cars is problems with the exhaust headers for our American viewers, or exhaust manifolds. Now this is mainly a problem seen over in the USA, and the reason for that is Ferrari had to fit precats into the headers or manifolds in order to meet the US emissions smog regulations. We don't have them on the UK cars, so issues with the headers are far less likely to occur, more so on the F430s here, because they do have a precat built into the headers. So something that you can do to try and identify this problem: listen when the car's cold for a ticking noise. The ticking noise starts to disappear as the car heats up because the metal expands and closes the gap, but obviously they're going to need replaced out if it's doing that. Next up, let's talk about gearbox position to the back of the engine bay there underneath that exhaust. Now obviously on the 360 we had two options. We've got the manual, which is what this car is, the more desirable option on the market, and we've got the F1 gearbox. Do not discount the F1 gearbox right away though, they can be great fun to drive. The only thing I'll tell people when they're considering both options is just remember the F1 system has got a lot more components to go wrong, actuators, pumps and so on, but it's not a reason to avoid them. Now internal to the gearbox, yes, you can have the occasional problem on these cars. Big problem is synchro meshes. Synchro meshes seem to wear, and more so on the F1 gearboxes. The problem is, if you're a driver, especially when the car's cold and you're in a manual car, if you feel hesitation going into a gear, you're going to back off, you're not going to force it in obviously, whereas that F1 system, it doesn't know any better, it's just going to force the gear through and wear that synchro mesh more and more. So something to keep in mind. Just listen out for any untoward noises, whether or not it's the manual or if it's the F1 system, coming from both the gearbox, each gear and the differential. If the car's had a heat exchanger fail in the past, there's every chance it could have damaged that differential. And the way that that tends to manifest itself is a bit of a bumping as you come to a stop with a slight bit of lock on. So basically just get a good test drive of the car and make sure there's nothing unusual. And the $1 million question, well, I would have $1 million if I was given $1 for every time I'm asked it. How long do clutches last? As long as a piece of string. It comes down to the way that the car's been driven, quite honestly. If I was to give a rough average of a well considerately driven car, a manual, you can see over 30,000 miles on them. F1, a little bit less, 20 to 25,000, but remember, that is so long as it's been considerately driven. And it's not always the driver's fault either. If they've got an unusual driveway or a steep climb into their garage, that's going to wear the clutch a lot more than one that doesn't have. So bodywork wise, all the usual stuff. Have a look for any crash damage. It's really hard to get a 360 repaired correctly. If it has been crashed, the panel gaps never seem to line up. And remember, that roof flows into the rear quarter. Those front wings, they flow right round and form one big section. So it's really hard to hide crash damage on one of these cars, which is a good thing for you, a prospective buyer. Now, we don't get rust per se with it being aluminium, but we do get corrosion on these bodies, typically in the places where water can tend to lie. So in these inlets here, have a good look in there for any bubbling under the paint. Low down on the car, just where it's going to have any water hitting it constantly. These are likely places that we're going to see a bit of corrosion. And again, bring that into the deal, because it's not cheap to get these repaired correctly, as I say. Now, moving towards the front, there's one particular bodywork item. Do we class it as a bodywork item? Yeah, we'll class it as a bodywork item. It's the headlights. Now, these have become a bit troublesome as the cars have aged, because you can see here, it's a clear lens and then it's body coloured inside the light. Now, splitting these in order to clean up the inside or get bugs out or dust or even faded paint to get renovated, splitting these apart is absolutely incredibly difficult. Very few people can do it correctly, unfortunately. Also, the lights are very expensive, so if you're looking to buy one from Ferrari, just forget about it. But if you are buying second hand, I've seen a couple on eBay and parts suppliers for around about £2,000 a piece. And remember, you need to find the one that's for the correct side that you need in the correct body colour. The headlights are getting tricky, so any damage on the headlights of the car that you're looking at, then make sure the garage or the seller repair them before giving the car to you. Here's a really interesting little quirk that a lot of right-hand drive Ferraris have. In fact, it's probably easier to just show you. The wiper arm is probably hitting the bonnet. So right here, because on a left-hand drive car, they have the wipers sweep the screen to the other side, it's not a problem. But on right-hand drive cars, they sweep over and they hit the bonnet. Ferrari just never bothered sorting that out. But when you think about how many right-hand drive Ferraris are made, it probably isn't worth their while. So there will be a little mark on the bonnet there. Don't think it's been neglected by the owner who's had it. So coming from the world of R8s and more contemporary supercars, one little quirk with this car is there's no button on the fob to pop the frunk. So you need to actually put the key in, turn the ignition on, flip a panel up, and then hit the button. Not the most practical, but that's Ferrari. So just before we get under that bonnet, one thing that comes to mind is absolutely worth mentioning. This isn't an inherent fault with the cars, but it's something that you're going to want to be aware of, and that is the ball joints. You might already know this, but these cars have a fierce appetite for ball joints. Now, rose joints, fantastic for feel. The car feels unbelievable. The feedback you get through them is fantastic, but they're not exactly made for longevity, and as such, they start to wear out. Now, the problem is you're going to find them all over the car, front, back, lower arms, they're everywhere. So just as you've replaced the fronts, the backs are probably worn out and you replace them, and then the fronts need done again. Realistically, every couple of thousand miles, let's say 4,000 or 5,000 miles, you're going to be swapping out some ball joints. Just something to keep in mind. When Ferrari made replacement parts for the ball joints, they didn't actually make the ball joints themselves either. They wanted you to buy a whole new arm. But thankfully, Hill Engineering stepped in and they make some fantastic replacement parts. So just put the Hill Engineering ones in. Don't worry about it, you're going to be swapping them again soon anyway. Just a couple of points to note under the bonnet of these cars, or frunk. We've got the little sticker there with the official colour code for the car. Maybe make sure that matches. And also, just for the purposes of having a nice complete 360, you want to make sure it's got the toolkit in there, and also the tyre inflator. Both of those should be present. You've got the toe and eye inside the toolkit as well. The torch should be there also, but I've never actually seen one that's got the torch in place. Couple of things to check as you get into your 360. Door handle and window height. Start with the door handle. These are really common for stretching the cables inside them. If someone's opened the door quite aggressively a couple of times, that can stretch the cable. So just make sure it works, make sure it's not coming right up or anything. And you can see as I do that, the window drops. Now, that's not uncommon. What is a bit uncommon, but not to these cars, is the height of the window. It can sometimes drop down and need realigned, otherwise it starts letting water and such in. So make sure the window is sitting inside the seal and the door handle works as you expect it to. So in the interior, these are holding up really well. A couple of things to be aware of, however. The early cars, again like this one, had a textured finish to both the centre console here and up on the dash. It can get a bit grubby looking over the years, but it can be refurbished. Again, just things that you can bring into the bargain with the seller or the garage. Now, the other thing, big problem with Ferraris of this era, sticky buttons. It affects the vents, the buttons, the ashtray, the grab handles. It gets everywhere, makes a right mess. If you've read about sticky buttons, yes, it's in the 360. Again, this is just something you're going to need to judge on the car that you're buying, whether or not it's due time for a refurbishment, and if it is, bring that into the bargain. And another thing that people often forget to check on these cars, especially if they're buying them during the daytime because they have no need to turn the lights on, but it's the instrument binnacle here. You want to make sure all the clocks light up, the speedo, the rev, the pressure and temp gauges, make sure it all lights up correctly. It's that 2000s backlit luminescent green panel, and it's really expensive to repair if it does go bad, so keep that in mind. So the last bit of advice I would give you on buying one of these cars, very possibly the most crucial piece of advice, and that is to buy a car that's got a proper, genuine service history to it. What do I mean by that? Well, these cars need to be serviced at least once a year, and the belts need done every 3 years. Now, you'll get sellers out there that'll say, well, I haven't serviced it every year because I barely used it. It doesn't matter. The oils still break down, parts can still perish despite the car not being driven, and in some cases, some parts can perish even more. The other thing you want to be sure of is that it's been a garage who really, really know these cars that's been looking after it, not a run-of-the-mill shop. There are a few of them here in the UK, so just get a good look at that service history and make sure it's been a reputable garage who have done the work. And also, goes without saying, you want to make sure you do a proper HPI check. Make sure there's no skeletons in the closet of the 360 that you're buying. A really good check for this is Vehicle Score. Log on there, put the plate in, and the reason I like this one is it'll give you all the salvage and mileage history as well. I'll drop a link in the description below alongside a 15% discount voucher. But for now, thank you so much for watching. If you do have any questions, drop them in the comments section below, and I'll see you for the next one.